extorsionando. Pero ellos viven de lo que tú
Thursday,
estás pagando.
December 6, 2018. Thank you for joining us. We are live in the studios of KMUD Community Radio. I'm Mary Massey with co-host John SAKOWICZ. Heroes and Patriots is a program about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. In this first half hour, we will be speaking with Adam Hochschild, who is an author and lecturer, historian. And in the second half hour, we welcome back Kathy Kelly, who's an activist and founder of Voices for Creative Nonviolence. Listener call-ins are welcomed and encouraged. You can speak to our guest today by calling 707-923-3911. Hello, John.
Good morning, Mary. Great show today. Great guest. And ironic that we'll be talking about World War I and the emerging New World Order on the day that our country is burying its 41st President, George H.W. Bush. Yesterday, I posted something on Politico. It went viral. I think it's on over 55 blogs now, and the nation is taking a look at the piece on just what a criminal George H.W. Bush was. Cindy Sheehan and I last night did a electronic march on Washington to de-mourn George H.W. Bush last night on Facebook. New World Order, globalism, nothing but the business of war. We'll be talking about all those things and how, in many ways, the origin of it was World War I, when many historians and students of the war want to view this as a clash of empires, a great classic, great power war, but it ended in something far more charged, a victory for the coalition that proclaimed itself a champion of the New World Order. Can't wait to tackle this subject with our guest. Why don't you introduce our guest?
Very good. Our guest today is Adam Hochschild. He is an American author, journalist, historian, and lecturer. His best-known works include King Leopold's Ghost, To End All Wars, A Story of Loyalty and Rebellion, 1914 to 1918, Bury the Chains, The Mirror at Midnight, The Unquiet Ghost, and most recently, John, in 2016, he's released Spain in Our Hearts. He's a graduate of Harvard in history and literature. He spent, as a college student, a summer working on an anti-government newspaper in South Africa, and he also worked as a civil rights worker in Mississippi in 1964. Both of those were politically pivotal experiences, about which he would eventually write in his books Half the Way Home, a memoir of father and son, Finding the Trapdoor, essays, portraits, and travels. He's also been a part of the Vietnam movement, something I'm sure that you can relate to being a veteran. And he's reported daily for Ramparts magazine in the mid-'70s. He is one of the co-founders of Mother Jones. I'm sure many of our listeners can relate to that periodical. So we are delighted to welcome Adam Hochschild to the show. Hochschild, excuse me.
Adam, welcome to the show.
Thank you, John. It's great to be with you.
Adam, you're a star. I'm so glad you made the time to speak with us. We'll do our best to podcast this show and get that audience that you so deserve. Let's get to it. In my opening remarks, I talked about George H.W. Bush and the New World Order. Can you set the stage for us, if you will, give our listeners a little bit of a history lesson, what the old world order was like before World War I, and then you had the war and the great carnage of the war, but you also had the consolidation of economic powers and banking powers, and then following the war, you had the emerging New World Order. Do you want to talk about that for a little while?
Well, I'm not sure how much the old world order before 1914 was different from what emerged after the war. It was still a case of the major empires ruling the world, except Germany pretty much dropped out of that group. In 1914, the big powers in Europe were Germany, France, Britain, and Russia, essentially. And all of them had sizable colonial empires. Britain's was the largest, of course, but France had colonies in Africa, Southeast Asia. Germany had some small colonies in the Pacific and several major ones in Africa. Russia also was a colonial power in its own way, having expanded into into Central Asia and the Caucasus, ruling over many, many non-Russian peoples. The war came along. It was unnecessary. It was tremendously destructive. And even though there was a big fuss made at the end about how we're going to have a more democratic world based on self-determination and so forth, a little of that applied in Europe, where various small states were carved out of what had been the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But it didn't apply as far as the rest of the world was concerned, where Britain and France kept their colonies and indeed took over Germany's colonies, basically as a sort of war reparations. It was all done under the label of these were mandates from the League of Nations, but essentially Britain and France helped themselves to, and South Africa helped themselves to what had previously been German colonies in Africa. So I'm not sure the world order changed that much.
Do you want to talk about the role of the banks and the financiers of Wilson's America, how they loaned billions of dollars to the Allies, how they were not so subtle in the ways by which Wall Street and Washington wielded these large debts over our allies in order to reshape the balance of power in the world, even so far as to summon world leaders, European leaders, to the White House instead of waiting on them in their own capitals, and in adopting a very condescending and even contemptuous tone that creditors often use with their debtors.
I think the whole business of U.S. loans and credit was enormously important in getting the United States into that war. You know, what we're taught in school books, or at least what I remember from my high school history class, was this about the First World War, that the United States was neutral. You know, tragically, our friends on various sides in Europe went to war. The United States was neutral until in early 1917, the Germans started sinking American ships, and so we had no choice but to enter the war. But that's not the real story. From the very beginning, the United States was indeed officially neutral in the war,
right,
but it continued to trade with anybody in Europe who would trade with it. That, in effect, meant Britain and France, because Germany was very tightly surrounded by a British naval blockade, and even though U.S. businesses were theoretically free to sell stuff to Germany, there was no way they could ship it there. So the U.S. carried on an enormous trade with Britain and France in everything from horses to oats to steel, right, to armaments, bullets, artillery shells, all kinds of things, at a huge volume. And as this terribly destructive war continued, Britain, France, and then Italy, when it joined the Allied side, began going into debt because they didn't have the money to buy all these weapons. And it was American bondholders and American banks who advanced them the money to cover that debt. Then the United States began to get worried that if the Allies didn't win, they might never get their loans back. And there's actually, in the early 1920s, it was revealed that Woodrow Wilson's ambassador in London had sent him a telegram saying, our entering the war may be our only way of maintaining our economic position here. And Wilson himself, even though we remember him as a great idealist and as somebody who promoted the idea of a League of Nations, also said something quite cynical about a year or so after the war ended, where he said this was not a political war, it was a commercial war.
Right.
So these economic factors, I think, were very important in getting the U.S. Into the war.
Yeah, I guess that's what I'm drilling down to in this, that the United States just doesn't emerge as a diplomatic superstate after World War I, but as a financial superstate over the other major countries of the world. You know, we offered them these gigantic war bond loans. We saved Britain and France and Italy from being driven into bankruptcy from the crippling wartime expenditures. But in exchange, we had leverage over them. We had the leverage of onerous repayment schedules. And increasingly, following the war, the United States of America exerted an influence far beyond mere debt collecting. Would you agree?
Yeah. I mean, when the war began, the U.S. was the world's largest economy in 1914, but Britain in particular had enormous power because they had this huge empire that stretched all around the world and were financially quite powerful. But when the war ended, Britain had lost more than 700,000 soldiers killed. France lost 1.4 million. Germany lost 2 million.
Right.
These countries were just wrecked. And the United States had become the world's creditor. And in a way, Germany had the advantage because they were the only major country in Europe that didn't owe money to the United States. But Britain and France were deeply in debt. So the war certainly increased American financial dominance in the world. There's no question about that.
So let's jump to the present time. Here we have Trump making threats against China, Iran, and Russia. We're preparing to pull out of an important arms control treaty with Russia. What lessons do we need to know from World War I that would be applicable right now?
I think the big ones are that politicians all too often think that starting a war is going to solve problems. And instead, it creates enormous problems that nobody anticipated. You can see an example of this not just in the First World War, but in our own war against Iraq that started in 2003. You remember that photograph of George W. Bush landing on the aircraft carrier with the big sign behind him saying mission accomplished.
Right.
Well, whatever the mission was, it still hasn't been accomplished. And I think the same thing happened at the beginning of World War I. First of all, everybody expected it would be over quickly. When Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany sent his troops to invade France and Belgium, he told them, "You will be home before the leaves fall from the trees." That was in August of 1914. And quite a lot of leaves fell from quite a lot of trees over the next 4 years before the soldiers came home. He expected the war would solve some problems for him. It would establish his dominance over France, and perhaps more important for Germany, their dominance over Eastern Europe and Russia. But of course, it was ruinous for Germany, and the legacy of bitterness and resentment it left behind was something that Hitler was able to manipulate very cleverly to gain power.
Let me take the devil's advocate position here for just a second, and then I'm going to turn the microphone over to Mary. Mary, I didn't mean to monopolize.
No, I just know we have listeners that want to call in.
Oh, okay. But I actually talked to Oliver Stone, who produced that wonderful series for Showtime, The Forgotten History of the United States, about this show with Adam today, and he said, "Don't forget to ask him this."
Ask away.
and this is what Oliver Stone wanted me to ask. He said, America has been in a wartime economy since World War I. You know, we World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Cold War, the Vietnam War, the new Cold War, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. War is what we do. It's our number one export. We are a wartime. We've been a wartime economy certainly since World War II. We can do nothing but make war because that's what we do, and our economy is based on it. Where would America be without it? I'm a little bit cynical, but how would you respond?
Well, remember that peace dividend we were supposed to get when the Cold War ended? It never came through. I think he's right. You know, it is woven into the government. You know, I mean, half the federal government is military stuff, and when you add in the expenses of, the Veterans Administration and pensions for soldiers and so forth, I think it's more than half of federal spending that goes to something that is directly or indirectly military related. And the curious and very sad thing to me is that even in the opposition among the Democrats, now there is very little questioning of these ongoing wars in Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq. There's fighting in all of these places, and there's a vast amount of military expenditures. We have, 10 or 11 aircraft carrier battle groups roaming the world's oceans.
Right.
We've got, enormous fleets of hundreds and hundreds of fighter planes. And, this has not helped make a safer world. And we are engaged in these ongoing conflicts in Afghanistan and the Middle East with no end in sight. The war in Afghanistan has now been going on for 17, 18 years. And it's taken for granted by almost everybody in Washington. I'm pleased to see a new crop of Democrats in the House of Representatives. I don't hear many of them questioning these wars, though.
Right.
If you've just joined the program, you are listening to Heroes and Patriots. Mary Massey here, and along with my co-host John SAKOWICZ, and we are speaking with Adam Hochschild. And we would like listeners to ask questions of our guests.
It's their airwaves.
It's their airwaves, and we would like to remind folks the number to call is 707-923-3911. Adam, you've been talking about the economics and how commercial these wars are. Outside of the financial part of it, are there other patterns or cycles that seem to lead us into war, or is it always an economy-based fact?
Well, that's a good question, Mary. I think there are a variety of things that lead countries into war. I'm not sure it's always directly economic. When there's certainly a connection. Would George Bush have gone to war in Iraq if instead of Iraq having 10% of the world's oil supplies, it had 10% of the world's supply of turnips or potatoes or something else? Mm-hmm. I don't think so. So there's often an economic motive there, but right. I wouldn't underestimate, especially if we're looking back at World War I today, the amount of martial pride and ideas about, foolish ideas about patriotism in the worst sense that motivate countries. It was certainly the case in World War I. There's a lot of talk in Germany about whether Eastern Europe was going to be run by Germanic peoples or Slavic peoples. In Russia, one of the reasons why Russia was so desperately eager to go to war was to avenge the terrible humiliation of having been defeated in war by the Japanese 10 years earlier. And it was especially humiliating to them because Japan was an Oriental power. So these were motivations somewhat beyond economic, and I think they often factor in when wars start.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, this is such a huge subject. Let's take this back to the commemoration of the 100th, the end of the 100th anniversary of World War I, where Trump went to Europe and snubbed Macron's peace forum on Armistice Weekend. And let's not forget what the Armistice Day, what the original intention was. Armistice Day was intended to perpetuate peace through goodwill and mutual understanding, and somehow that got I don't know, I want to say corrupted, if you will, by celebrating veterans and celebrating war. What did Trump miss on Armistice Weekend when he decided to boycott the peace forum?
Well, I'm not a big fan of Macron, but I'm glad he did try to use the day to talk about peace, which I think is an appropriate way to use the day that was the 100th anniversary of this war that, killed more than 9 million soldiers and perhaps an equivalent number of civilians and laid the ground for an even more destructive war to come. The people I think should be celebrated as we come to the end of this anniversary season are the people at that time who saw the war as madness and who refused to fight or who supported those who refused to fight. And there were a lot of them. There were a lot of them in every one of the major countries fighting. There were people who went to jail because they would not take part in the war. Here in the United States, for example, we had Eugene V. Debs, the great labor leader, who spoke out very strongly against the war after the U.S. entered it. And for that, he was sent to prison. He was still in prison in November 1920 when he received nearly 1 million votes for president on the socialist ticket.
Wow.
We also had the great anarchist leader Emma Goldman, who organized to protest the draft. She was put on trial, and when at that trial she was accused of being unpatriotic, she told the jury, "My patriotism is like that of a man who loves a woman with open eyes. He's enchanted by her beauty, but he is not blind to her faults." And I think that's a pretty good definition of patriotism we could still use today. Mm-hmm. And they had counterparts in England, in France, in Russia, in Germany. And those are the people I would have liked to have seen celebrated on Armistice Day.
Indeed. By the way, as a footnote, I just had a listener email me that the United States renamed Armistice Day as Veteran Day in June of 1954. So that was a shift. At about the time, the military-industrial complex was starting to emerge.
Right.
If you had Bernie Sanders here in the studio with us, and as we know, he's just introduced a bill in the Senate to curb the United States' support of Saudi Arabia in this terrible war in Yemen that has claimed the lives of 58,000 children who have starved to death in just the last 3 years. Greatest humanitarian crisis in the world today. How can we stand up to the military-industrial complex? How can we start curbing the war powers of the president, who seems to go? It's a recent history of just going to war unilaterally without consulting Congress, doing whatever he wants to do. How would you advise? How would you strategize with Bernie Sanders and the other bipartisan members of Congress who just want to rein in these terrible war powers?
Well, I think it's good that they're trying to do something to prevent the U.S. from helping Saudi Arabia wage this war in Yemen. It's so strange and sad that it took the murder of poor Mr. Khashoggi to make us do that. Because that war in Yemen has been going on for many months. Saudi Arabia has been doing all kinds of horrible things to many people for decades. It's a country where people are beheaded, people have their hands cut off, women are executed for witchcraft, and yet it was this murder of an American resident in the consulate in Istanbul that seems to have stirred people to action. Well, so be it, but I'm glad they're trying to act, and I hope they get a bill through the Senate.
Adam, we have a caller for you. Listener, welcome to the program. Go ahead with your question.
Good morning. Really wonderful, important show and conversation. President Eisenhower warned us about the power of the military-industrial complex. And I don't know if any of you recall Marilyn Waring. She was a young prime minister, member of parliament in New Zealand, had a prominent film at the time focusing on the military-industrial complex as a major economic issue that we aren't looking at. And yes, we could end all wars, but we have an economy that's really built on the manufacturing of weapons, missiles, all the apparatus of war. And I think I'm wondering how that can be addressed, because I really see it as an economic issue and not just as a policy issue. Thank you.
Well, I think we can all think pretty easily of other things that we would like that industrial might to manufacture. As somebody who grew up in New York City, I would love to see a few of those billions going into revamping the New York subway system, There are similar important public works projects, building better schools and all kinds of other things. The problem is that, all of these corporations are so clever in lobbying Congress, in when they come up with a new fighter or bomber or tank or something, they make sure that its parts come from, dozens of different congressional districts, and it's become a sort of octopus that it is very, very hard to remove the tentacles of. It's going to take a determined president and determined majorities in both houses of Congress to do that in a serious way. And I'm not optimistic it's going to happen anytime soon, but I do think the more people can put that issue on the table, the better.
I want to ask you about one thing on the business of war, Adam. Waste, fraud, and corruption is a big part of the business of war. Literally the day before 9/11, literally before the World Trade Towers came down, then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld had a press conference where he declared war on something else, not a war on terror, but a war on waste, fraud, and corruption. There is an interview with CBS that never aired because it was preempted by the attack on the World Trade Center, where Donald Rumsfeld is accompanied by one of his auditors and an inspector general's report from the Department of Defense, where he's talking about one out of every $3 for the earmarked for defense was being wasted and lost and stolen from the American taxpayer due to waste, fraud, and corruption. You can find this the press conference on YouTube just by putting in Donald Rumsfeld, September 10th, waste, fraud, and corruption at DOD. Do you want to say something about just how the business of war has almost baked into the cake, where a third is lost to waste, fraud, and corruption that is never audited, never reclaimed, mainstream media never makes a fuss about it. This is really part of the scam. This is part of the game. This is part of the business.
It is. I mean, the thing is, that kind of waste, fraud, and corruption is not easy to see in the way that we can easily see, if the government is supposed to be paving the street in front of your house, the city government, and they do a bad job and they don't patch the potholes, and the workers laze around and take long smoke breaks and so forth. You can see that. But the highly sophisticated corrupt equivalent of that is going on in the manufacture of a super high-tech aircraft carrier or fighter plane or whatever, we can't see, and it makes it very, very hard to correct. But I do think we have to think of it not just in terms of how much waste is there, but in terms of whether we've got our priorities straight in spending all that money on all that stuff anyway.
Exactly.
Adam, we are about out of time with you, but I would like to, if you have a contact information, a website where our listeners can follow your writing and some of your publications, is there a place where they can find you on the web?
I'm not as up to date on that as I should be, but if you go to the page about me at the Graduate School of Journalism at UC Berkeley, where I teach, you'll see a bio, a list of all my books and links to them, and links to some recent articles.
Wonderful. Well, we thank you so much for being with us for this first 30 minutes and talking about the First World War and the 100-year anniversary. Adam Hochschild, thank you so much.
Happy holidays, Adam.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you, John. Happy holidays to you both.
Thank you.
You're listening to Heroes and Patriots. It's 32 minutes past the hour. I'm Mary Massey along with John SAKOWICZ. Our next guest, Kathy Kelly, has been with us before. I would like to give brief information about her. She has, she has founded the Voices for Creative Nonviolence. Most recently, she's been an activist, an author, a pacifist for really throughout her entire adult life. And she is with us now on the phone. I would like to mention again that folks can call in and speak with Miss Kelly at 923-3911. Kathy, are you with us today?
Hello, Mary and John. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of your show today.
Well, welcome back. We have been talking about war, and I know that is something, unfortunately, very familiar with you. Could you just give us sort of an update on where you are with things related to Yemen?
Well, thank you. It hasn't been possible for human rights activists to travel to Yemen unless you have had a long history of working in the country. And so we've tried to learn from Yemenis themselves, from scholars, particularly Issa Bloomy, but also we learn from patterns of what we've seen before. And it seems as though, once again, the plight of children, the Save the Children reported 87,500 children under age 5 to have already died from starvation caused by war and displacement and disease in Yemen. And certainly it's the reality facing these children that I think should guide every step. And yet the United States has been very, very complicit in, over the years, supplying huge weapon systems for the Saudis and others in a Saudi-led coalition, even when there's ample evidence that the Saudis could very well be eyeing Yemen's resources. People in Yemen are poor, but Yemen's not a poor country. And, it's got a huge coastal line, and just the fisheries alone are extremely valuable along all that coastline, but also the possibility of offshore oil resources and other kinds of mineral wealth inside of Yemen. And so great powers, it would seem, are willing to continue the war making so that they can grab at land and resources. It seems like it's greed. And, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, had said in 2017 in a televised interview to his populace in his country, a prolonged war is in our favor. Well, it certainly hasn't been in the favor of people suffering from disease and starvation in Yemen today.
Kathy, do you want to talk about how Yemen is a proxy war and the United States' tangential involvement in that war through Saudi Arabia is really a way to pick a fight with Iran?
Well, thank you, John. It seems like there is some evidence of Iranian support for the war in Yemen. There was a report today that some Hezbollah and Iranian soldiers were evacuated out of Yemen by being deceitfully included in the numbers of people that were taken by Martin Griffiths out of Yemen because of the peace talks, which we must hope will be promising peace talks. There was a story about the Al-Houthi Navy offices being overtaken just very, very recently, and the claim was made that there was some evidence found there of missiles that had been supplied by Iran. But, this pales, it completely pales. It's just a fraction. It pales in comparison to what the United States has given the Saudis and the Saudi-led coalition, which is inclusive of the United Arab Emirates. And billions of dollars of weapons have been sold to both of those countries. There have been many ways in which the United States has given the Saudis and the UAE diplomatic cover at the United Nations. The United States has assisted with surveillance, with targeting, with supplying laser-guided missiles, these precision-guided missile systems, cluster bombs, combat littoral Navy ships. The weaponry that the United States has supplied has been proven to have directly targeted children, for instance, on the August 9th attack of children in their school bus with a Lockheed Martin manufactured weapon. So when we talk about a proxy war that, somehow the United States is using this war to somehow vilify Iran, it seems as though there's such flimsy evidence for Iranian alignment with the Houthis. In fact, one point people have made is that you will not find Houthi leaders or rank-and-file Houthis going over to Iran for the yearly Hajj, which is the requirement of Islam, if you can make it to go to Mecca or to another holy site. There isn't any evidence of that kind of alignment between the Ayatollahs in governance in Iran and the rank-and-file Houthis, who many of them are part of the Zaidi clan, and they don't really like the way that Iran's governance is arranged. So it's confusing to me. I think that it's much more plausible that the Saudis, with U.S. support, are bludgeoning Yemenis into submission because they want to make land grabs and they want to take potentially rich resources because they're running out of their own resources.
Right. In the half hour that preceded our visit with you, we talked about World War I and how it kind of set the stage for a war-based economy here in the United States. It set the stage for the emerging New World Order that was not just occupied with globalism, but war itself. And here in the United States, the military-industrial complex. We know that military spending is well over 60% of discretionary spending here in the United States. How can we rein in that I won't even call it a public policy that fails to acknowledge the existence of this kind of military spending? How can we rein in that obsession with war, that waste of of financial resources, 60% of discretionary spending? How can we take America off the track of a war-based economy and put it back into some kind of sane, some kind of sanity, some kind of a path that is just sane? Where do we start? Is Bernie Sanders on the right track right now with introducing a bill that would rein in the president's war powers? What can we do as peace activists?
Well, I know it's overwhelming, but I think we have to figure out how we can continually educate people. I mean, Dr. Hochschild's research and writing has been so helpful. And we're in terms of to end all wars, this notion that somehow we're made safer by the bloated and sickly dominating military budget. I believe it's a sick budget because it promotes values that have nothing to do with improving human life within the United States or beyond. So education. It's a bit like realtors when they're trying to sell property. They'll say location. We have to emphasize education. And even just, going down that path, who do we educate? Go to the universities, even to the chancellors, to the department heads, and ask them, what are you doing to help enable future generations to recognize the great danger posed to them by militarism in our society? Here we are living in a permanent warfare state. There is no way that people can solve the very real problems we face if we don't grapple with the military robbing, plundering, taking all of our resources, our genius, our funds, in order to keep on building the capacity to aim arsenals, including nuclear arsenals, at other people. So that education step is crucial. We need to go to faith-based communities, to community groups, including our allies who are working with regard to environment and immigration and prison issues. They're all important. But none of those problems can be solved if all of our money, all of our resources keep going to the military. The military won't solve those problems for us. So I think the education step is crucial, and certainly going to the media as well, to the mainstream media, and then doing exactly what you and Mary are doing, devising effective alternative media.
Yeah, well,
and I think, not to give up.
Yeah, well, it's Cindy Sheehan and I got together last night on Facebook, and we did an electronic march on Washington to de-mourn George H.W. Bush. a huge architect of the military-industrial complex and the New World Order. We had, I think, 2,300 people join that march at the last minute.
Oh, brilliant!
Yeah, it's just sickens me that we're lauding this guy as a great patriot. Don't get me started. I don't want to get off track here with the show.
But let's also note that Cindy has been fasting, which I think is such an ethical thing to do in regard to Yemen. And she picked up the baton, more or less, from Pamela Bartlett. And this is something that an individual can do, to make a statement and say, I won't cooperate with this. And, her action, I think, reverberates very, very far because of all the noteworthy things she's done in the past. But I think, it certainly challenges me and it makes me ask, so what am I doing right now?
Exactly.
Right. We are speaking with Kathy Kelly. She is the co-coordinator of Voices for Creative Nonviolence. And John SAKOWICZ and I, Mary Massey, would welcome your phone calls at 707-923-3911 if you would like to speak about the topic that we're speaking of right now. Recently with the bombing of the school bus back in August of this year, do you, from your perspective, Kathy, feel that this was a war crime?
Oh, unquestionably.
Okay.
They were children on that school bus, and they were on their field trip, their summer field trip. The bus was parked while teachers went out to get some of the supplies for a picnic, and a Lockheed Martin manufactured 500-pound missile was fired directly at that bus. There were identifications of 36 of the children. There most likely were actually 40 to 44 children killed. But, of course, in those terrible, terrible blasts, you really can't reassemble the bodies for identity. And, those little children who survived would all be traumatized for life. And they went back to school a few weeks ago, and they were carrying their UNICEF-issued backpacks. Those are such wonderful gifts that UNICEF gives out, because tucked into them are vaccines and antibiotics and things that can save families. And so the children had their backpacks that were spattered with blood.
Yes, I have read that. Yep. We have
of course it was a war crime.
Exactly. We have a caller, Kathy. Caller, welcome to the program. Go ahead with your question.
Thank you so much, Kathy. I really appreciate everything that you're doing and your group, but I wanted to ask about the peace negotiations going on right now in Sweden, if we could get back to the actual attempts by Yemenis to make a peace agreement and how that's going to succeed. One of the issues is the role of women in that, and I wonder if you could talk about participation of Yemeni women in that, for instance, the representatives from the Yemeni Women's Pact for Peace and Security that have not been as incorporated in the peace negotiations as they would like. I just would like to hear your take on the peace negotiations, the likelihood of success, and the role of women in that, and Yemeni women in building for peace.
Thank you, caller.
Well, thank you. I think that United Nations statistics have shown again and again that when women are educated and literate and can assume more effective roles just at the grassroots community levels, this is one of the things that can help overcome situations of impoverishment and hunger. Well, of course, in Yemen, you have a man-made famine. It's something that was artificially imposed. But I think it's important to go back to the history. Sheila Karapico wrote brilliantly about this, that at the time of the Arab Spring, young Yemeni women were very, very active in leadership. They were forming processions wherein they'd wear red, white, and black caps over their garb, which was a very traditional garb, certainly, but taken from above, the photos would show the women marching, which was a very brave thing to do. Women were in the lead, making videos, doing art presentations, organizing lengthy fasts to help get people out of prison, so they hoped. They also had orchestrated a procession from the city of Taiz to Sana'a, a long walk, and women were participants in those things, but they were sidelined. Their concerns and their organizing efforts were badly sidelined by the Gulf Corporations Council, which did allow for removal of the dictator, Ali Abdullah Salah. But they appointed his deputy who is now Abdul Mansur Hadi, now supposedly the recognized but only appointed, never elected president of Yemen, and proceeded to fulfill the desires of the greedy people that were trying to perpetuate siphoning off Yemen's resources and making an elite very, very wealthy who were subservient then to some of the corporate powers that wanted to profit from Yemen's resources. And so I think those grassroots groups were sidelined, and also there's been such an imposition of imprisonment and torture within the prisons that it's very, very dangerous for people to speak up, whether they are women or men. Right now it's a very dangerous thing, and so we have to hope that in Sweden, the United Nations and other groups will act according to conscience, listen to the women, listen for the voices of children, and I think especially listen for the voice of a child too frail to cry.
Indeed.
Thank you.
I'm just so moved. Listen to the women, listen to the children. I was at a recent meeting of the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, and it was Yemeni women, peace activists, speaking to the group, largely women, I may add, including some from UN peacekeeping forces. And 4 Yemeni women were originally scheduled to attend. The State Department denied visas for 2 of them. Mm-hmm. And you say, and you wonder, what is the Trump White House thinking? What is the State Department thinking? Why silence mothers and children? I mean, I just don't get it. I guess that's a rhetorical question. Let's talk about the open letter to Bernie Sanders, Senator Sanders, that you and others have signed, where you talk about the cost of war. It's not just money. It's not just $1 trillion a year. It's not just 60% of discretionary spending, but there's also an environmental cost. Militarism is also a source of the erosion of our liberties. It's the top justification for government secrecy. It's the top creator of refugees. It's the top saboteur of the rule of law. It's the top facilitator of xenophobia and bigotry. It's the top reason we're at risk for nuclear apocalypse. If that's a lot, I know, Kathy, but if you will, and from your letter to Senator Sanders, why don't you just summarize what the true cost of war is, what the true cost of a war-based economy is?
Well, it's also the cost of people like Senator Sanders being unable to speak as vigorously, as vociferously as we need him to speak, because he's also in thrall to major corporations. He has to go back to Vermont, and he's got military production facilities in Vermont, and he doesn't want to alienate the portion of the military-industrial congressional media complex that is dominated by some of the most powerful lobbyists on Capitol Hill, and those are the defense companies. And we need him to level with the United States public and say, look, this is the situation we face. We've let ourselves become a permanent warfare state. And we've now exalted militarism to something like a religion. I think the major religion in the United States today is militarism and militarization, and it affects so many areas of our lives, as you enunciated them, John, and then even just, constantly being told we have to thank the military, we have to absolve the military. We're not supposed to look at the fact that every single day 22 veterans of military combat in the United States commit suicide, and that's only beginning to, scratch the surface of the pain inflicted by war after war after war. So I think people have a chance to say to Bernie Sanders, look, we're with you in appreciating the risks that you've taken, but in order to accomplish what you envision, you're going to have to name the United States military for what it is, a criminal, wrongful, death-dealing institution.
Yeah, it's about those 22 combat vets that take their lives every single day. Peter Van Buren has written widely about something called moral injury. Peter was the architect for reconstruction in northern Iraq after the two wars in Iraq, and he just saw and participated in the waste, fraud, and corruption and of billions of dollars in what should have been foreign aid and humanitarian aid just going into all the wrong hands, and suffers from what he calls moral injury. Matthew Ho, another friend of ours, a Marine, he was, I believe, the commander of company headquarters in Kabul, also talks about it. Moral injury. So you have a lot of PTSD being caused by committing war crimes, but you also have something called moral injury that the Veterans Administration now accepts as a diagnosis, where there's something innate in the human psyche that if you participate or even witness in a legal war, you send yourself down the path towards self-harm, self-destruction, and maybe even suicide. It's called moral injury. It's a concept now. And I think as a nation, our national psyche suffers from moral injury. Do you want to talk about that, Kelly? Kathy?
Thank you, John. You know, I think often about the hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children under age 5 who were punished for committing no crime. How could children ever be accountable for a dictator running their country? And those children paid the price under the economic sanctions. Those economic sanctions prevented them from getting desperately needed medicines and clean water and food. And they went to the hospitals in the hundreds and then in the thousands and then in the hundreds of thousands. And hundreds of thousands of them never left the pediatric wards. They died tortuous deaths in their mother's arms, and we had gone over there with the preceding group to Voices for Creative Nonviolence, Voices in the Wilderness, and the mothers would literally pull us into the bed, sitting cross-legged with their children dying in their arms, and they would beg us. They would beg us to go back to our countries and to ask people, why were people in the United States wanting to punish mothers and children? That they meant us no harm.
Kathy, we have a caller, and we only have about 2 or 3 minutes left, so we'd like to get this last call in. Caller, go ahead. You're on the air.
Yeah, when you're talking about the moral damage, I made up a term like post-traumatic stress disorder, and I call it PMMD, post-military moral disorder. Mm-hmm. And PMMD, I made that up to fit it because I've worked with vets and returning to Vietnam and so on and so on and so on, and I just think that's really a part of it, and thanks for the show.
Yeah, you could actually Google up the term now. It's called moral injury, and it's a separate and distinct category from PTSD. So PTSD, the injury was caused to you, say, by the enemy, you're getting shot at, you're shell-shocked, what have you. Moral injury is the injury we cause ourselves by participating or witnessing an illegal or immoral act. It's real. Combat vets suffer from it. They're taking their lives because of it.
Kathy, in this last minute, could you let our listeners know where they might visit your website and how they might become involved if they so choose? Where can they do that in this last minute?
Thank you, Mary. VCNV, the acronym for Voices for Creative Nonviolence, is our website, vcnv.org. And if people would want to develop a presence with the book bags, we'll supply you with 40 book bags and placards with the names of the children as a way of commemorating children who have been killed by war in Yemen. Please let us know if there's any way we could be of help, either with supplying articles, coming to be a speaker, being part of vigils and demonstrations. We think this is a crucial time, of course, to end all wars, but to particularly focus right now on U.S. complicity in the war on Yemen.
And again, the way we get those 40 book bags is how?
You could write to info, I-N-F-O, at vcnv.org. And certainly write to me directly, Kathy, K-A-T-H-Y, at vcnv.org. And we'll also, a delegation will be heading over to Afghanistan regularly delegations will be going in December and January, and we'll continue to keep people informed about the Afghan peace volunteers. And, of course, we're eager to work with people on protesting nuclear weaponry. There's plenty of activism to be involved with, and we encourage everybody to keep going in their own communities.
Kathy Kelly, Voices for Creative Nonviolence.